Okay, so I want to say a few very general things in this lecture about developing and evaluating moral theories. And now these are issues we're going to come back to the entire semester. And we'll, talk about these in more detail. We will do a lot of evaluating moral theories. Um, but I thought would be good to say just a few more general things about this, to look at this from kind of a pretty high altitude, just to get some idea of what we're going to be doing, how this works. Okay. So I guess the first question, is how do we come up with a moral theory? How do we develop a moral theory? And how do you evaluate one once you do come up with a moral theory? How do you tell whether it's a good moral theory or not? So I think there are generally, philosophers will disagree on the numbering. Some people will slice these up a different way. But there's generally 3 steps. And those 3 steps are: try to come up with a theory that explains moral judgments that we are sure about, that we agree on. Try to find, we have a lot of different moral judgments. Some of them we're pretty certain about, or I think most people are. And a good moral theory tries to explain why that is. What did these judgments have in common when they say certain actions are right? What do those actions have in common when they say certain actions are wrong? What do they have in common? Try to find a deeper reason or rationale for our seemingly really huge variety of moral judgments. Then we look at some other moral claims and judgments we're sure about, and we test the theory, see if it comes up with the right answer. Finally, we apply the theory to less certain cases. Now I want to talk about each of these steps in a little more detail. So step 1, try to come up with a theory that explains moral judgments we are sure about, that we agree on. And now I'm going to guess that some of you might push back a little bit on this. You might say, well, there isn't any such thing, right? We as a society, we Americans are, you flip on the TV, you hear about how polarized we are. We disagree on so much stuff. Even if we Americans agreed on things, there's so many other societies in the world, and they certainly aren't going to agree on moral judgments, right? Here's what I would say. You should not overestimate moral disagreement. It isn't as total or as complete by any means, certainly not within American society, but also even between our society and others. It's not as complete as it's made out to be by any means. Look, there are some claims, and I'll give you a really memorable one. This is not my example. The philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe came up with this, and the whole point is this is terrible and memorable. But if I ask you, is it morally acceptable to boil a baby alive, you wouldn't be like, I don't know. And you wouldn't be, well, I don't think so, but who knows what other people think. You would be like, good Lord, that is awful, that is terrible, how do you even think of that, right? You would think that is wrong, and you would be very confident that any other person who took the question seriously would also say, my God, no, that is wrong, right? Look. Think of some others, right? These people are getting rare, they're dying off, but, if you found out your seemingly kindly old neighbor down the block had actually been a guard in a death camp in World War II, you wouldn't be like, well, I don't much like it, but hey, we can't judge his culture. You'd be like, no, this guy is a terrible person. He deserves to go to jail. He certainly shouldn't be enjoying a comfortable retirement in suburban America, right? There's a good article. I usually have classes read it. Ours is pretty compressed. We're moving pretty quickly, so just didn't really have time for it. But there's a really good article by this philosopher, James Rachels. It's actually a chapter in his textbook on ethics, which I always think about as, having students buy and using as my textbook. It's also $80. It's a good book. It's not $80 good, I don't think, right? But Rachel's has this really interesting and I think convincing argument. He's like, look, don't even overestimate the differences between cultures. And one of the reasons you shouldn't do this is because there are some basic moral rules every culture is going to need to function, to hang together, right? If your society doesn't have rules about murder, if it doesn't say murder is wrong, generally we shouldn't kill people, society is just going to come apart at the seams because people are going to be killing each other all the time, and eventually people aren't even going to want to be around each other. If your society doesn't have some rules against lying, if it doesn't say lying is wrong, you're never going to be able to get anything done because nobody's going to trust each other. Nobody's ever going to be able to coordinate their actions. All right, so I'll get off my soapbox, but just generally do not overestimate the level of disagreement. Now, I will say, when I throw out these examples in class, or even other examples, there's always some smart aleck who's like, well, I don't know about that. And I suspect, goodness do I hope actually, that usually these people are just trying to get attention. They want everybody to pay attention to them because they're making crazy claims, right? And or maybe they want to annoy their professor because, right, it's fun to annoy authority figures, right? I suspect, golly do I hope, they don't actually believe what they're saying. If they do, that's terrifying. But look, and we'll talk more about this, just because there might be some crank out there who believes a crazy thing doesn't mean, as I've said with burden of proof, we have to take it seriously, right? Even if somebody in the class really does believe, well, I don't know, we can't judge Nazi death camp guards. I don't know that we have to take that any more seriously than we do the guy who says, well, the earth is flat. Or 9/11 was a conspiracy, right? I don't think we have to take any of those people seriously. I don't think we have to take, even if the moral skeptic is sincere, I don't know how seriously we have to take it. All right. Back to my point, though. The theory should give us some account of why we make these judgments. We say murder is wrong. We say lying is wrong, at least unless you have a good reason. Well, why is that? What do murder and lying have in common that makes them wrong? And our account of what makes these things wrong should be a good account. It should be a recognizably moral account. If you say, well, what's wrong with lying is that you often get caught, and that's embarrassing, that seems a weird account of what makes lying wrong, right? Then we should test the theory against other claims and judgments we are sure about. The theory should give us the right answer, and again, it should give us the right answer for good reasons. If I say to you, do we have a duty to save a child drowning in shallow water if we could do so by just getting our pants wet? We all agree yes, and a good moral theory should say that we have that duty, right? Because that's a pretty clear, we would all be obligated to do it. And the theory should give us a good reason for it. If our theory's reason is, well, you should save the child because other people might find out you didn't, and then they'll be mad at you, and wouldn't that be awful? That's not a really good... It gives us the right answer, but that's a really weird reason for that answer. If the theory gives us the wrong answer, if it says something like, fine, whatever, let the kid drown if you want to, then we have a case of modus tollens. If the theory is right, then X moral judgment is actually wrong. So we have three responses. One, we can try to show that the theory doesn't really require us to reject this moral claim, right? We'll see how a lot of different philosophical theories try to do this, right? Because they're all the ones we're going to look at least are going to conflict with some common moral judgments, and a lot of times the response will be, well, actually, it seems that the theory says not to do this, but, if we look closer, it actually fits with common sense. Or we can reject the theory. When we look at egoism, even refined egoism, we're going to see that it's going to conflict with a lot of our moral judgments, and I think that's a good reason to reject egoism. Finally, we can reject claim X. We can reject the moral claim. If the theory's really good, maybe that if it conflicts with some bit of apparent common sense, maybe we should reject that common sense and not the theory. And let me give you guys some examples of this. This isn't morality, but it's in science. When Einstein came up with the theory of relativity, it actually had the result, for pretty complicated reasons, that the current theory of the universe in Einstein's day was wrong. That's what his theory said. The current theory of the universe in Einstein's day was the so-called steady state universe. It said the universe had been around forever. Did not have a beginning. It just always existed. Well, Einstein's theory actually had this result that this was false, that the universe had not been around forever. And so Einstein was embarrassed by this, so what he did was he tinkered with his theory to try to show that, well, it really doesn't have this result, that the universe has some kind of beginning. Well, why is this embarrassing? Because it turns out that the universe actually does have a beginning. The Big Bang Theory, it started, I forget how many years ago, but long ago there was this huge explosion. That's how everything formed. By tinkering with his theory to avoid this apparently absurd claim, Einstein actually deprived himself of a great scientific discovery. It was one of the great regrets of his life. If you want to look at a more clearly moral case, the philosopher John Locke, if you guys ever look at the Constitution, Locke had a huge impact on the American Constitution. Madison was a great student of Locke, great admirer of Locke. Pretty much all the founding fathers were. But anyway, Locke had all these arguments for religious toleration. In the Britain of his day, there wasn't much religious toleration. You had to be a member of the Church of England, or the government was going to make life hard for you, if not even outright throw you in jail. And so Locke argued that society should tolerate different religious denominations. He basically said, well, among other things, you can't encourage religious belief because, if you say you all have to be a member of a certain church, religious belief is about belief. People will just lie about it. They won't really believe it. Locke's arguments showed, he thought, that we should tolerate different Christian denominations, but also that we should tolerate as a society pretty much anybody who believed in God, right? Muslims, Jews, Hindus. Locke thought anybody who has any kind of religious belief should be tolerated. Locke's theory also seemed to show that society should tolerate atheists. Locke didn't like this. He has all these arguments for why his theory of religious toleration doesn't commit us to tolerating atheists. These all look embarrassing now. Most of us would say, no, Locke, your theory does, and that's not a bad thing. You, Locke, Einstein should have taken option 2. You should have too. It was wrong of you guys. Or sorry, option 3, reject the claim. That's the option you should have taken. Reject the claim that atheism somehow shouldn't be tolerated. Reject the claim the universe has always existed. You shouldn't have taken option 1 to try to fit this claim with your theory. Final thing we do in evaluating a moral theory, we apply the theory to less certain cases. And the question here is, can the theory tell us something about these cases? And there are two reasons that we want a theory to be able to do this. Much of the point of a moral theory is to give us guidance in cases where we're not so sure. If the theory can't do that, in a lot of ways it's like a hammer that can't hammer a nail, right? But even more deeply, perhaps, and, a bit more theoretical, but also a real issue, if the theory doesn't tell us anything about cases where we're not sure, you might think that the theory doesn't really say anything at all. In the Middle Ages, medieval science was pretty terrible, and one of the great scandals of medieval science, they'd talk about drugs or compounds that put people to sleep, right? It made people drowsy. And their explanation for why it did this was like, well, these compounds have a dormitive virtue. Well, what's that say, right? If you say something has a dormitive virtue, you mean it puts people to sleep. So medieval scientists, they said these fancy things, but what they were really saying was, this puts people to sleep because it puts people to sleep. If a moral theory can't tell you anything about cases you're not sure about, you might suspect that what it's really doing is just saying, well, it's wrong because it's wrong, right? That it's not really enlightening us, not really saying anything. Now, but one issue I want you guys to keep in mind, what is it that we want an ethical theory to do? Give us answers to uncertain cases is definitely one thing. But is it the main or even only thing? Philosophers we look at will have different answers to this question. One of the reasons that I think people will disagree is that they will have different ideas about what a good moral theory should do. Different ideas about why it is we even want a moral theory. Keep that in mind. That's an issue I will keep returning to.